Good afternoon, and welcome to the virtual Abraham Lincoln Institute Symposium, hosted by Ford's Theater. My name is Jonathan White, and I'm chairman of the board of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. Normally, we meet at Ford's Theater every March to hear wonderful speakers talk about the life and legacy of our 16th president. This year, unfortunately, we had to cancel our symposium, but we are grateful to Ford's for offering to host a series of live webcasts with our speakers. We will be meeting here on the internet every other Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for the next few weeks to hear the speakers that we were unable to hear in person in March. I want to thank ALI President Ron Seward for making arrangements with our speakers and the team at Ford's Theater for making it all happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Caroline Adolci, Gary Erskine, Juliana Avery, Colleen Pryor, and David McKenzie. Excuse me. Throughout the lecture, you can post questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. And I want to let you know you don't have to wait until the end to post them. And our speaker will address them at the end of the lecture. On Twitter, please use the hashtag FordsALI. Our speaker today is Joseph A. Fry. Dr. Fry is Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he has taught courses on U.S. foreign relations and the U.S. South. An award-winning teacher, he is the author of 6 books, including Dixie Looks Abroad and the American South and the Vietnam War. Today, he will be speaking about his most recent book, Lincoln, Seward, and U.S. Foreign Relations in the Civil War Era, which was published by the University Press of Kentucky in 2019. The reviewer for North and South magazines stated, quote, "This is, quite simply, the best book I have read on the Civil War in the last 12 months. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Fry."
Thank you, John. Excuse me. And thanks also to the Abraham Lincoln Institute and Ford's Theater for inviting me to participate in this symposium.
Thank you for coming.
The stronger side does not always win civil wars. The 13 American colonies prevailed against the British, and the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front defeated the United States. Outside intervention was essential to the outcome in both of these conflicts. France aided the American colonies, and the Soviet Union and China supported Hanoi and the NLF. As these examples illustrate, foreign relations can play a crucial role in deciding civil wars. The North's success in forestalling European intervention in the American Civil War was critical to the Union's survival. European intervention on the side of the Confederacy could have altered the war's outcome. While precluding British, excuse me, or French intervention, the United States also had to avoid war with any other country, which would have certainly ensured a Confederate victory. President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State William Henry Seward were the Union's unlikely and highly successful foreign policy team. They had come to their respective offices from starkly different backgrounds. Seward had graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Union College at the age of 19, was admitted to the New York bar in 1822, joined a prominent Auburn, New York law firm, and married the boss's daughter. He and his wife enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, replete with Tiffany glassware and imported wines, and Seward had traveled to Europe twice by 1861. Born in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor, Lincoln spent much of his hardscrabble youth doing manual labor and was self-educated. After he passed the Illinois bar in 1836 and married Mary Todd, the couple lived in one room above a Springfield tavern before purchasing a modest house for $1,200, where they resided until they moved to Washington. Lincoln had achieved solid middle-class standing, but his life was provincial and his lifestyle modest compared to Seward's. Both men gravitated toward politics, joined the Whig Party in the 1830s, and became Republicans in the mid-1850s. Here again, Seward's record was significantly more impressive. 2 terms as New York's governor, a decade as a U.S. senator. By 1860, he was the most recognizable, politically seasoned, and accomplished member of the Whig Republican Party. By comparison, Lincoln had served 8 years in the Illinois legislature and 1 term in the U.S. Congress, but failed in 2 runs for the U.S. Senate. Despite challenging and debating Stephen Douglas in 1858 for Illinois' U.S. Senate seat and speaking widely on behalf of Republican candidates, Lincoln acknowledged his relative obscurity when he asked an old friend in 1858, "What's the use of talking of me for the presidency while Seward, Chase, and others are so much better known to the people? Nobody, scarcely outside Illinois, knows me." Lincoln's nomination for president by the 1860 Republican Convention could have rendered the partnership even less likely. Seward was outraged that the Illinois nomination was, as he said, given to a little briefly, he campaigned actively on Lincoln's behalf in 15 states or territories. Following his victory in the general election, Lincoln asked Seward to become his Secretary of State. The president-elect sought to reward all wings of the party and to recruit the best talent for his cabinet. Seward, in turn, considered himself eminently qualified and wanted to remain in public office. As he had remarked years earlier, he was hardly content to go back to Auburn and amuse myself by writing history the rest of my life. This unlikely partnership had begun, but the working guidelines were yet to be determined. Seward assumed that his more prominent public standing and political experience would afford him decisive authority in the new administration. He sought to seize control, first in early March 1861, by resigning in an effort to prevent Salmon P. Chase from becoming Secretary of the Treasury. Lincoln kept Chase, but quietly convinced Seward to remain in the cabinet. As the president explained, he could not afford to let Seward take the first trick. A month later, Seward tried again. In an effort to appeal to national loyalty in the South, he recommended the United States threaten Spain and France with war in response to their military and political interventions in the Caribbean. He also prodded Lincoln to delegate authority and allow him, Seward, to govern. The president took the second trick by wisely rejecting the provocative warning to the two major European powers and by bluntly asserting control over the administration. By late April, Lincoln declared, "Seward knows that I am his master." Seward subsequently agreed, stating, "There is but one vote in the cabinet, and that is cast by the president." When Seward accepted Lincoln's primary authority, the partnership was cemented. Clear lines of authority were not the only bases for this professional partnership and what increasingly became a close personal friendship. The president and secretary had much in common. They shared a sense of U.S. destiny that envisioned the United States as the world's foremost example of political democracy, and they believed that only a coherent, reunited nation could achieve that destiny. Both exhibited strict personal honesty, a refusal to hold grudges, and they took great pleasure in discussing American history. Neither pair paid careful attention to his habitually ill-fitting clothes or often rumpled hair, and both thoroughly enjoyed a good joke or story. Lincoln frequently walked across Lafayette Square from the White House to Seward's home, where the two talked late into the night. The president, who did not smoke or drink and seldom swore, visited with his friend, who delighted in consuming ample quantities of wine and incessantly smoked imported cigars. Lincoln found Seward's profanity-laced diatribes amusing, the secretary's hospitality relaxing, and the energetic, optimistic New Yorker's company a relief from the burdens of the war's carnage and a refreshing antidote to the president's proclivity for depression. According to John Hay, there had been few instances of an official association hallowed by a friendship so absolute and sincere. Lincoln and Seward practiced a productive division of labor. The president established the overall foreign policy framework by promptly ruling out a second war, moderating Seward's initial truculence toward European nations, and recognizing the crucial connection of a viable foreign policy to what he called the progress of our arms, on which all else depends. The president also brilliantly portrayed the conflict as a struggle for the survival and indeed the Western world's experiment in Republican government. Through his public addresses, messages to Congress, and letters written for publication, Lincoln practiced public diplomacy designed to influence both his domestic audience and foreign nations. His July 4th, 1861 address to Congress was representative. The war's importance, he wrote, involved more than the fate of the United States. The whole family of man was waiting to see whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. Seward, in turn, managed day-to-day foreign policy matters, such as resolving disputes over U.S. interference with European commerce, managing the fallout from Confederate raids on the United States from Canada, or pushing back against French military and political intrusion into Mexico. The Secretary made his most significant contribution to U.S. diplomacy by convincing Britain and France that diplomatic recognition of the South as an independent country or military intervention on the side of the Confederacy would lead to war with the United States. Seward practiced a form of brinksmanship in which he walked a diplomatic tightrope, which included enough bluster and threat to create uncertainty and caution in Britain and France, but not enough belligerence to provoke an unacceptable second war. For example, in April 1861, as rumors circulated in Washington that Britain and France were about to extend diplomatic recognition to the South, the Secretary attended a dinner party where he screamed at the British, French, and Russian ministers to the United States that recognition of the South would mean war with the North and that the whole world would be engulfed. The British minister reported to London that Seward would be a dangerous Secretary of State. Seward's bark was primarily calculated and certainly much harsher than his ultimate bite. By the summer of 1861, he had begun to soften his tone, but his repeated threats continued to create uncertainty and caution among Europeans over the ensuing 3 years. Despite brinkmanship's overall success, the policy created real risks. The ongoing U.S. warnings and the resulting British and French anxiety increased the possibility of diplomatic or military miscalculations by either the United States or the European powers. The Trent Affair, the gravest threat of an Anglo-American military clash during the Civil War, demonstrated this hazard. Captain Charles Wilkes, the commander of the USS San Jacinto, created this foreign policy crisis by stopping the Trent, a British mail steamer sailing near Cuba on November 8, 1861. Wilkes captured James Mason and John Slidell, Confederate diplomats en route to Europe, and allowed the Trent to continue on its journey to England. According to accepted international law, Wilkes should have taken the ship, the diplomats, and their papers to the United States for trial. Wilkes' action received resounding public and press approval in the North. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells sent him a congratulatory letter, and the House of Representatives passed a laudatory resolution. The British response was decidedly different. Prime Minister Palmerston and Foreign Secretary Russell began preparations for a possible war, demanded that the Confederates be released, and called for what they termed a suitable apology. These demands were officially delivered to Seward on December 23rd, and the Lincoln administration was given 7 days to respond with a plain yes or no. The British minister to Washington observed correctly that Lincoln and Seward were left in a very painful dilemma. They could endure the humiliation of yielding to England or incite a disastrous foreign war. Lincoln and Seward responded cautiously. The president omitted any mention of the Trent Affair in his annual message to Congress on December 3rd, and he assured visitors to the White House that the crisis would be arranged. In response to a suggestion that Britain was making idle threats, Lincoln recounted the story of a friendly Springfield bulldog. I know the bulldog will not bite. You know the bulldog will not bite. But, the president asked, does the bulldog know he will not bite? With one notable exception, Seward was equally restrained. The secretary said virtually nothing publicly, save a belligerent outburst on December 16th at a dinner party. His intentions were more apparent in peaceful reassurances to a French diplomat and the increasingly moderate tone of major New York and Washington papers, a change which was generally attributed to the secretary's influence. As late as December 21st, Lincoln favored employing international arbitration to determine Mason and Slidell's fate. This was a bad idea. Since virtually all major European countries agreed with the British position, it would have been difficult to secure a suitable arbiter. Even more important, proposing arbitration and quibbling over a settlement would have required going beyond Britain's 7-day deadline. When Lincoln gathered his cabinet for a 4-hour meeting on Christmas Day, only Seward came with a coherent plan to surrender Mason and Slidell, and a 26-page draft of the dispatch he would send the British. He noted that Wilkes had acted without instructions from Washington and had violated international law. Therefore, Mason and Slidell should be released, but Seward offered no apology. Instead, he congratulated Britain for ostensibly accepting the U.S. legal position, opposing the impressment of American citizens into the British Navy on the eve of the War of 1812. That following day, neither Lincoln nor any other cabinet member offered an alternative response. After the second meeting, Seward asked Lincoln why he had not stated a counter case, as he had agreed to do. The president smiled and replied, "I found I could not make an argument that would satisfy my own mind, and that proved to me your ground was the right one." Although Palmerston and Russell rejected Seward's intellectual sleight of hand regarding an apology, which the secretary had actually directed at his U.S. audience, the British leaders agreed to de-escalate the crisis. By deftly maneuvering between national humiliation and a devastating war, Lincoln and Seward successfully concluded the first year of directing U.S. foreign relations. The second year was no less harrowing, since Britain and France came frighteningly close to extending diplomatic recognition to the Confederacy. Recognition would have confirmed the South's legal standing as an independent nation, indirectly endorsed the institution of slavery, and enabled the Confederacy to contract loans and to forge political and military alliances. Humanitarian, economic, and strategic considerations prompt Britain and France to contemplate recognition during the summer and fall of 1862. The war seemed to have devolved into a horrifyingly lethal stalemate. The ongoing fighting threatened to devastate European economies by blocking access to the raw cotton needed by their textile industries, and both nations viewed two weaker American countries as more manageable than one increasingly powerful United States. Based on these perceived interests, the two great European powers debated from July through November whether to offer to mediate the conflict or to recognize Southern independence. Seward responded to both possibilities with his usual threat of war. The secretary's brinkmanship was important, but Lincoln took the decisive step to combat the recognition threat. He acted on the assumption, as he said, that no European power would dare to recognize and aid the Confederacy if it became clear that the Confederacy stood for slavery and the Union for freedom. On July 22nd, the president submitted a proposed draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. All slaves in states still in rebellion were to be declared free as of January 1st, 1863. But the proclamation did not apply to the border states of Missouri, Maryland, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Emancipation, the president later emphasized, would help us in Europe by convincing them we are motivated by something more than ambition. According to a well-informed reporter, Seward's agreement was tardy and reluctant. Seward preferred that slavery be destroyed gradually by the North's advancing armies rather than by a proclamation, which he feared might provoke a backlash among anti-Black Northerners, alienate the border states, incite a slave revolt in the South, or induce European intervention to secure cotton. But just as Lincoln had deferred during the Trent Affair, Seward fell in line behind the president. In an important contribution to the cabinet discussion, Seward urged delaying the proclamation's announcement until the United States had achieved military success. He feared the proclamation would be viewed as the last measure of an exhausted government on the retreat. Lincoln agreed, acknowledging this was a consideration he had overlooked. The ostensible military success came on September 17th, when Union forces stopped Lee's invasion of the North at the Battle of Antietam. 6 days later, Lincoln issued the Provisional Emancipation Proclamation. The immediate response from the European leaders and press was harshly critical. They denounced Lincoln's actions as transparently expedient and hypocritical, since he had declared slaves free in the South where the United States had no control, but not in the border states occupied by Union forces. Seward promptly directed U.S. diplomats to emphasize that European interference would be, in essence, taking sides in a war between freedom and bondage. And by late 1862 and early 1863, the proclamation's impact had become apparent. When British anti-slavery activists, Quakers, and working men held numerous meetings and demonstrations to endorse the proclamation, Lincoln responded to sympathetic petitions by writing letters to be published in British papers. He also provided a model petition for use by Union backers. It asserted that no new nation whose fundamental object was to maintain, enlarge, and perpetuate slavery should ever be recognized or admitted into the family of Christian and civilized nations. The proclamation and the British public's response and Lincoln's public diplomacy via his letters and model petitions persuaded British leaders they could not side with the South and the preservation of slavery. And France was unwilling to intervene without British concurrence. By early February 1863, Seward concluded correctly there was no prospect of foreign intervention, and the Union had escaped what was in effect the most severe foreign policy crisis of the Civil War period. Seward's stern warnings, geopolitical developments on the European continent, and the European realization that economic relations with the North outweighed access to Southern cotton had influenced the British and French. But Lincoln's decision to bring slavery to the forefront had provided the final and decisive deterrent in recognition of the Confederacy. 1862 proved to be the pivotal year for U.S. Civil War foreign relations. There would be no decisive aid for the weaker South and no U.S. war with a third nation. The unlikely foreign policy of threat, caution, and compromise had succeeded brilliantly, and foreign relations had played a critical role in the preservation of the Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was wonderful. And I should point out to our audience that Joseph A. Frank goes by Andy. So if I call him that, that's you all know what I'm saying. We've gotten some questions in. Our first one is, at what point in his presidency did Lincoln realize that foreign policy would be critical in his conduct of the war?
I think that Lincoln understood that from the beginning. And the fact that both he and Seward recognized the critical importance of foreign policy was in decided contrast to the Confederacy, which I think pursued an assumption that cotton would automatically bring European intervention. And the Confederate leaders nominated far less capable people to represent them in Europe than did Lincoln and Seward. And particularly, Lincoln and Seward chose Charles Francis Adams for Great Britain, which was the critical country. So I think Lincoln understood this almost intuitively from the beginning. In 1854, Lincoln had said that slavery was such a burden for the country because it compromised us in foreign policy. It caused us to be viewed as hypocrites abroad. So even in the 1850s, at some level, I think Lincoln understood this.
I want to ask a follow-up question of my own. I love how you are couching emancipation and the Emancipation Proclamation as a foreign policy issue. Can you talk about some of the other foreign policy issues related to race? I'm thinking of the Seward-Lyons Treaty or the recognition of Liberia and Haiti.
Well, I think that Lincoln and Seward had begun the war emphasizing restoring the Union and de-emphasizing slavery. And it was partially a result of appealing to the border states and partially Lincoln's ambivalence about whether he had the power to abolish slavery legally where it already existed. As the war went on, he changed his mind, obviously, about the importance of this. And beginning in the spring of 1862, I think they tried to signal this in a variety of ways. Passports for Black people, recognizing Haiti and Liberia, tried abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, and then the Seward Lines Treaty, which struck at the slave trade. But none of those things served to alert the Europeans in the way they hoped that it would. And it's at that point, I think, Lincoln moved on. And obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation had all kinds of military and domestic implications, but that was when Lincoln began to see it precisely in foreign policy terms. As he said, we must free the slaves in order to ourselves. So that would be my response.
Yeah, good. Another question from viewers online says, you mentioned Seward threatening war with Europe on several occasions, but also that his bark was worse than his bite. How close do you think we came to war with Europe during our own Civil War?
I think that the Trent Affair was the closest, probably. The other time, the other point at which Lincoln or which Seward was most direct in his warnings was in the summer of and early fall of 1863 with regard to Britain building a Confederate Navy, and especially the fear over the Laird rams, these ships that were going to have steel rams on the front. A kind of collateral question is, would Lincoln and Seward ever have carried through with the threat? And I have, it's a what if question, but I have serious doubts. Seward really was very disinclined to use force in foreign policy. And he'd made that quite clear in as early as the 1850s. And Lincoln, at the very beginning of the war, made it clear that there could be no second war. So I think it was interesting that Seward, with Lincoln's approval, was able to make these threats effectively when I think in reality they would have never carried through. That it would have probably been suicidal to do so. But I would think I think the summer of 1863 and the Trent were the closest points where this actually might have happened through miscalculation or something of that nature.
Yeah. Another question from a viewer online says, besides Great Britain and France, what other foreign nations did Lincoln and or Seward have significant dealings with?
Well, these two were by far the most important. In many ways, the third really important country was Russia. And our dealings with Russia in many ways were minimal, but Russia consistently refused all overtures toward intervention in the American War. And at points, particularly in the summer and fall of 1862, when Britain and France were seriously considering this, the Russians simply said no. So that I think in many ways our interactions with beyond Britain and France were fairly minimal, certainly minimal importance, but Russia was a major kind of third-party player in discouraging British and French thoughts about intervention.
Right. Another person asked, can you tell us how you became interested in Lincoln and Civil War era diplomacy?
Oh my. Well,
and can I add a follow-up of my own to this?
Yes.
So I know you've written very broadly on diplomatic history. You teach and have taught on American diplomatic history from the founding to modern wars. In answering that question, can you also sort of talk about how you would rank Seward among the various secretaries of state?
Yes. Well, first, my senior thesis in college, a very long time ago, was about U.S.-British foreign relations in 1861, during the first year of the Civil War. I subsequently wrote a dissertation and a biography of Henry Shelton Sanford, who was U.S. Minister to Belgium during the Civil War. And I've thought a lot about the war in terms of thinking about the South and American foreign policy. But I also had edited for many years a series that looked at biographies in American foreign policy, and I could never find anyone to do Seward, which is ironic. And I began to think about, well, maybe I'll do it myself. And when I read about this, I'd been teaching the Civil War diplomacy, but when I really read deeply, it was clear that the two of them needed to be considered, I thought, at the same time. Seward. I think that Lincoln and Seward is normally ranked among foreign policy historians as second only to John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State. But I think Lincoln and Seward have to be ranked as the most important and effective President, Secretary of State team in American foreign policy history. And maybe, James Monroe and John Quincy Adams could be second, but I think Monroe doesn't even remotely compare to Lincoln. If you're trying to balance, a team.
I agree with that.
I know that there are other options, but I think Seward is easily the second greatest Secretary of State after Adams.
Well, that's a good segue into our next question. Someone wrote in and said, you spoke about how different Lincoln and Seward were from each other and yet how close they became. Do you have a favorite story about their relationship or something that surprised you as you were doing your research?
Well, I love the story. I love their sense of humor and that they could kid one another. And Lincoln and Seward Seward often went on carriage rides with Lincoln, and he often went to the theater with Lincoln. They were on this carriage ride, and the driver was the team was very bulky, and he was having a terrible time, and he was swearing, and Lincoln said to him, "Are you an Episcopalian?" And the man's response was, "Well, I don't go to church often, but when I do, I'm a Methodist." And Lincoln's response was, "Well, you swear just like Secretary Seward, who's a deacon in the Episcopalian church." And that they seem to be, and Seward's comment at one point was that he was just astounded that Lincoln could have become such an important person when he neither drank, smoked, or cursed. So that it seemed to me their humor with one another did suggest how close they had become personally.
To follow up on that, can you talk about how Frederick Seward, the Assistant Secretary of State, sort of fit into that relationship?
I think that he was primarily his dad's secretary. And I have no doubt he did a lot of helping the secretary with drafting dispatches and so on. I don't know beyond that. Nicolay and Hay were important too. I mean, a good deal of the information about Lincoln's secretaries about this relationship were observations that they made. But of course, Frederick William Seward eventually wrote a biography of his dad, and there's information, again, similar kinds of information about the relationship that it seems to me these are three awfully close observers. And Frederick William, at one point, one of his comments was, it's very unusual for a president or a leader to be able to admit that he is mistaken.
Yeah.
Lincoln was a big enough person and in this relationship to make those sorts of admissions if he thought Seward had a better idea.
Right.
And Seward, of course, couldn't remain in office unless he were working for Lincoln. But I think the relationship was not, I don't think that's the only reason he wanted to be in office, or that he agreed with the president.
Right, right. Another question we got asks this: what do you think of arguments that a French victory over Mexican Republicans at Puebla in 1862 might have led to French intervention in the U.S. Civil War?
More what if, huh?
Yeah.
I think Napoleon III, of course, began the Mexican project as part of a larger grand design in which he wanted to promote what he called the Latin race versus the Anglo-Saxon race, Catholicism, to control U.S. kinds of expansion and power in the Western Hemisphere. And his whole project then became, and I think that explains why he was habitually wanting to mediate the conflict. Two weaker countries on the North American continent, along with Mexico, would be easier to deal with than a powerful United States and a reunited United States. Ironically, once they didn't win at Pueblo, and it took till 1863 to take middle of the summer of 1863 to capture Mexico City. By that time, you have Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and the enormously growing power of the American military, so that the whole Mexican project actually became a kind of, it prevented him from taking more aggressive steps, because unless the Confederacy won, Mexican project wasn't going to succeed. And at the same time, if he intervened with Seward threatening war, Mexican project wasn't going to succeed. So it was very interesting that what he started out that thinking the Confederacy would be an advantage actually became a burden to that, his attempts to control Mexico. So I'm very reluctant to think that even had the French won there, that given long-term Mexican resistance, given the European backdrop, an increasingly complex and a growing power in Prussia, that was going to work regardless. And even with that, even had he won, they won there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We are just about out of time. I again want to, here we go, recommend Andy's book to you, Lincoln, Seward, and U.S. Foreign Relations in the Civil War Era. Thank you so much to all of you at home who joined us today. We're grateful to Andy for his wonderful talk and to Fords for hosting this wonderful event. We will meet here again in 2 weeks at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, July 6th, to hear William Bartelt speak about his new book, Abe's Youth, Shaping the Future President. Until then, please stay safe and please keep reading good books about Abraham Lincoln.